I want to start by saying I was proudly raised in a Reform household and chose to become a conservative rabbi as my parents had their own kind of coming of age as Reconstructionist Jews. And I became a born-again Jew through Orthodox practice in college. So my family has been all over the map. And indeed, like many of you, we have family and friends who married Jews, who married non-Jews, who are never married, but each of us may have been personally touched by the material of our topic today. And I put the quote, you'll see in a second, intermarriage, in quotes. If you'd like to start using the chat box, we'll be pausing at a couple times through this class. I like to start classes, especially when it is a potentially controversial topic, an emotionally charged topic. If folks want to put in the chat the first word or two that come to mind when you hear the word intermarriage, and just to give me a sense of where you're coming from today regarding your experiences personally or communally with this topic. I see, and Julie has put the link to the material in case you don't have it otherwise. Great, so a good emotional check-in from Nancy, stress. Christy says intercultural. Carrie says unease, and Michael says worry. Rosa says inevitable, interesting. So we're getting a real variety of responses here. Tanya says kosher and non-kosher, interesting. One of the pieces here is like Freya says, compromise in conversation. That I'll simply jump in here is to note not only are there a variety of responses here, but perhaps there are paradoxically one and the same responses that we might feel on either side of this supposed divide. What I'd like to suggest is, as we look at ancient sources on this topic, that perhaps not only is this not such a contemporary conversation, that our people, however we understand the Jewish people, the descendants spiritually and genetically of ancient Israel, have we been dealing with this topic for a great number of years, not just centuries, but millennia. But actually, perhaps the same values are animating folks on different sides of this debate, of this conflict. And if we can take a step back, gain some literal and figurative distance from today's debate and conflict, as I tried to develop in a much longer series around the conflicts within the community of Israel today and throughout time, in getting that kind of emotional distance, perhaps we can appreciate how many of us are coming from the same similar emotional places and animated by the same kinds of values out of loyalty to not just a tradition, but to how we want to be loved and respected in our family spaces and our communal spaces, personally and professionally, what it means to live in the image of the divine. What does it mean to be created in God's image, and to live that image every day is a challenge. So in particular, let's now dive into this material from that big gadol, that big picture. And okay. So sharing my screen. Let's zoom up. So if, by the way, if you have to leave the class early, you can reach me at any point regarding this material and other parts of the series, which I'm happy to teach for your communities in other contexts. You can reach me at my email address, andyshug@gmail.com, here at the top of this text sheet. So we start with two passages from this week's Torah portion that deal with marriage law. They are seemingly unrelated initially on this first page regarding the topic of intermarriage, but we'll see on the second page how they become intimately related in a later text. So we see first restrictions on God's assembly. This is from the New Jewish Publication Society translation, Deuteronomy 23, 4 through 9. I believe it's in the fourth aliyah of this week's portion. So I'll just read in English. You can follow along in the Hebrew. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation. Why? Because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Bil'am, son of Beor, from Petor of Aram Naharaim, to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to obey Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, for the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. What's interesting is it pauses there. That's the end of the aliyah. And then the next aliyah picks up with these two verses. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in this land. Children born to them may be admitted into the congregation of the Lord in the third generation. Okay, so what I want to point out here is that these aren't just laws restricting entry of other ethnic groups, other nations, people into the nation of Israel in ancient, in Deuteronomic law, but there's narrative included here. It's why is it that that Moses is including these laws on behalf of God in this prophecy. Moses is actually recapping for us earlier chapters in Israel's history, and in saying, on the one hand, we're restricting entry far greater to Ammonites and Moabites because of this, their nastiness, their withholding of chesed, of loving kindness to us when we were in a position of weakness. And then what's interesting is the rabbis break up this passage into two different aliyot. And so when we come back with the next aliyah, we get these two verses, which are less restrictive. Why? You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. Just to note that on its face literal reading here, how we make sense of that and how later texts make sense of it, especially rabbinic texts, we'll come back to shortly. So then we find later in the Torah portion these two verses about levirate marriage, which in Hebrew yibum. So this is as opposed to a blanket statement about prohibitions, this is a very I think the term is casuistic. It's a conditional situation, stating Deuteronomy 25, 5 and 6, when brothers dwell together and one of them dies and leaves no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. No, stay in the family. Her husband's brother shall unite with her. He shall take her as his wife and perform the levir's duty. The first son that she bears shall be accounted to the dead brother, so his name may not be blotted out in Israel. So I'm going to pause here before I show you how a text that many of you are probably familiar with, whether you're aware of how these connections get made. Just to let's come back to the chat box. Any questions or concerns about what you've now seen in these first two texts from our Torah portion, Ki Teitzei? So Nancy says Ruth was a Moabite, right? Good exception. So Nancy has maybe called ahead to where we're going on the next page. I won't give that away just yet. Carrie points out something about verse 4, about the commandment never to accept Moabites or Ammonites. Right, about being inhospitable to us. So maybe there's a difference between indifference rather than hostility. Interesting. So to name here what's going on in the Torah text? How might we regard this exclusionary language? Is it indifference to rather than sort of animus? Are we supposed to regard these people as enemies, or merely as saying, you know what? In contemporary language, Israeli language, political language, anachnu kan, hem sham. Let's just observe a sort of barrier between ourselves. Okay. Tanya points out, interesting, Yehuda and Tamar, that there is a reason for that. I won't go into, but I see you, and you're on to something there, which we might not get to in this half hour, but that's you're getting warmer. Doug says, so many rules are given without explanation. Why are these rules explained? Excellent question. Perhaps the rules are explained because all of this is a conversation, right? Moses is presenting these laws as a representation of laws or narratives that arise earlier. And as a lot of academic folks would point out, Moses, or at the time of the Deuteronomy text, is in conversation with other texts, maybe including the text that follows, as Michael sees, since Ruth was a progenitor of David, can we consider the exception to the political for the king kind of a non-birther thing? Interesting, using, again, contemporary controversy as a touchstone here. I'm going to come, so a number of you are on to where this is heading. Without further ado, I'm going to return to the text study and reward those who were on to where we're going with this excerpt from the book of Ruth. Yes, so the book of Ruth immediately presents the explicit identification of Ruth, one of the greatest heroines of biblical texts, of our biblical tradition, as a Moabite. These two sons, Naomi's two sons, in verse 4, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then those two, Machlon and Chilion, also died. There's a great plague that's taking place in the land. So the woman, Naomi, was left without her two sons and without her husband. So then fast forward to verse 22 in that first chapter of the book of Ruth. Thus Naomi returned from the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And now really fast forwarding to much later in the book, chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Boaz, the hero of the story, said to the elders and to the rest of the people, I am also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, as my wife. And then underlining here, this is to return us to the previous text passage regarding Yibum, levirate marriage, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. So what I want to point out here is the text makes, without actually stating ever, this prohibition on Moabites marrying into ancient Israel, it clearly and consistently identifies Ruth, not just as Ruth, but Ruth the Moabite, and yet only addresses an animus in the sense of how folks regard her either with indifference or without providing for her and her mother-in-law upon their return from Moab. And so we see her having to gather forgotten sheaves in the field and to make use of those protections, those Torah protections for the less fortunate and the marginal, to make sure that they are fed in our society and in ancient society in particular. But those do continue. Those laws do continue to have some practice today. But Boaz here creates a room within the narrative through the seemingly unrelated law by saying, actually, we have a competing concern here. Because Ruth was married to an Israelite who did not have a son, I am actually doing my Torah duty by marrying her and hoping to perpetuate the name of her deceased husband, so that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. So we see in the book of Ruth, not just a resolution to an apparent conflict. It is using law to create new narrative, to flesh out, literally and figuratively, flesh out how law and narrative intersect on this topic. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One, as a number of you have pointed out in your comments, is that the child of Boaz and Ruth is the grandfather of King David. And as a couple of you, pointed out in your comments in the chat, this isn't the only narrative in which we have a supposed or what seems to be a challenge within Torah law for someone entering the covenant or entering the Jewish community, the biblical Israelite community in some way, and they enter through even illicit sexual relations, and then the product of that, the progeny, go on to enter the Davidic line. Classic other instances that I've not included here because I want to get to how the rabbis address these challenges, and then how one of my great teachers from Jerusalem, Dr. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, a tremendous author, how she handles this in the contemporary period and articulates these values. What she and our rabbis point out is it's also Lot's daughters and Ruth and Tamar, Tamar and Judah, who have relations that give rise to different elements of the Davidic line. Clearly, there is something messianic about this, this resolution of a seeming paradox and controversy through the intersection of law and narrative on this topic. So I move us now, so I'm going to pause very quickly to see if there are any reactions, questions, comments in the chat box. Good, sorry, so Frana is anticipating what we're about to see in the Mishnah of Yevamot, and then a story in the Talmud that gives greater sense to where the rabbis, who don't explain why it is that there's maybe an exception here. The Mishnah does not explain this, but we'll see that in a second. Tanya also says, so maybe there's something about still in the family, that this is a family dispute, that these restrictions arise because of something that's quite ancient, but that maybe these things get resolved in time. And right, so and Frana also says, it sounds like a lot of sibling rivalry. Yes, there's a lot of competition in the ancient world, and we've seen that tribalism has not gone away, that we continue to see a lot of competition in our, and competitiveness in our contemporary context. Anything else here? And Reba raises a good question. This is one of the things that is hard for us to hold on to, and I won't delve deeper into this right now. But to imagine, for many of us, it's so hard to imagine, to know, to be able in a family tree to trace back more than 2 or 3 generations, and to know how contemporary a challenge that is, especially for many of us Ashkenazi Jews who have experienced great dislocation in the last century, maybe 2 centuries, is that for much of Jewish history, people lived within 50 miles of where their family had lived for centuries. And so 10 generations was not hard to, for most of Jewish history, for centuries and centuries, folks really could trace their family back at least 10 generations. Much harder in the contemporary context. So that requires a bit of moral imagination and moral imagination here. Okay, so so yes, is this also pointing to conversion law? I'm not going to treat conversion law today, but as Tanya also points out, there's a connection to Solomon coming up. So I'm going to go back to the screen share, and thank you for your comments, especially those who have been so enthusiastically writing into the text box over and over again, the chat box. So we move now from the biblical canon to rabbinic texts, and we have this really terse statement in Mishnah Yevamot, right? This is the earliest rabbinic section of law regarding levirate marriage, and they pick up on this connection, not referring to the book of Ruth, referring only to the verse from our Torah portion, that Ammonite and Moabite males are prohibited from entering the congregation of the Lord, and their prohibition is eternal. That stays entirely. Oh, but aval nekevotehem mutarot miyad. However, their women are permitted forthwith, immediately. Right? So they basically, without any explanation, just rewrite that law entirely. And as one of my Gemara teachers at the University of Judaism, now the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, said that there's a great academic line that the more canonical a law is, in the eyes of the rabbis, the more likely it is to be at risk of reinterpretation. We see this all across the Talmud. It's a brilliant move of the rabbis for handling difficult texts that are seemingly unethical, immoral, challenging in one way or another. So they simply say, "Oh, this doesn't apply." And why doesn't it apply? Let's scroll down here to the Gemara. This is a story, an agada, regarding that Tannaitic dispute, this dispute from the earliest generation of Mishnaic rabbis. So this was a Tannaitic dispute, an Ammonite but not an Ammonitess, a Moabite but not a Moabitess. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, the editor of the Mishnah. But Rabbi Shimon, one of his colleagues, one of his counterparts, challenged this. And Rava, a later rabbi who lived about a century later, so it looks like they're in conversation with each other, but actually Rava is an heir to the conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. And he teaches, in order to explain how Rabbi Yehuda would have taught here, quoting Psalms 116, what is meant by, "You have loosed my bonds, pitachta lemoserai." A phrase that many of you might know from Hallel. David, so here's the story that Rava tells. He spins this tale that King David, told the Blessed Holy One, "Master of the universe, two bonds that were upon me you have loosed, Ruth the Moabitess and Naamah the Ammonitess." Rava also taught, so Ruth is his great-grandmother, and Naamah is his daughter-in-law. Naamah is one of his son Solomon's many, many wives. Rava also taught what is meant by, and this is from Psalm 40, what is meant by, quote, "You, O Lord my God, have done many things. The wonders you have devised for us, none can equal you." So Rava teaches, for me, quote unquote, it is not written, but for us. This teaches that Rehoboam, Solomon and Naamah's son, sat on the lap of his grandfather David, who said to him, "Regarding you and me were these two verses uttered." So Rava is spinning a tale in service of Rabbi Yehuda's teaching, unexplained teaching. How is it? Rava's trying to handle this challenge of how do you explain Rabbi Yehuda's crazy upheaval here. And it's that how could we have this exclusion and also embrace not just our family, but the family of two of our greatest heroes in the biblical and rabbinic imagination, that of King David and his son, King Solomon. As I said at the beginning, this isn't just about our family story and any of our families, those of us participating in this class today. This is really about humanity. As Dr. Aviva Gottlieb-Zornberg, who has a fascinating personal journey to share, she has her doctorate from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. She has taught in the Orthodox community, in an ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem for many, many years. I believe that Julie Seltzer and I both were students of hers at the Pardes Institute at different times. So in her tremendous book, The Murmuring Deep, one of three large volumes of commentary bringing together literary criticism and psychoanalysis and the insights of our rabbinic tradition, she has this to say: the main purpose of the book of Ruth is to, quote unquote, teach how great is the reward of those who do deeds of chasadim, of loving kindness, quoting Ruth Rabbah 2:15. In the end, the book of Ruth tells a tale of a certain kind of human being. How does this way of being human relate to the concept of law that defines Ruth? The law that most significantly defines this world is an exclusionary law that is never articulated in the text. Throughout the whole course of the narrative, its shadow looms over Ruth. Quote, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the community of God. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever enter into the community of God." Deuteronomy 23:4. This law, repressed in the text of the book of Ruth, bans Ruth from ever marrying into the community that she has so passionately insisted on claiming as her own. And then she cites, "Your people are my people and your God my God." Ruth's classic statement from the Megillah in chapter 1, verse 16. I suggest, Dr. Zornberg says, I suggest that if Ruth is described repeatedly and redundantly as Ruth the Moabite, this is a way of intimating the legal barriers that frame her world. If no explicit mention is made of this law, its presence nevertheless informs all of the interactions in speech and in silence of the narrative. Repressed, it is nonetheless everywhere operative. And then she continues about 10 pages later. Naomi's one resource in returning from exile that might have motivated her to hope is Ruth, who is invisible, inaudible, and banned by law from entering the community of God. Because she is a Moabite, Ruth is excluded from Naomi's world. This is the law, and its reason is clear. Quote, "Because they did not come out to greet you with bread and water on your journey after you left Egypt." Deuteronomy 23:5. The Moabite stigma originates in a historical failure of chesed, of loving kindness, of connectivity, of acknowledgement of the other's need. The Moabites are not feeders, maintainers of the world, but in this narrative, as we have seen, it is precisely the Judean world that has failed to sustain the social networks, the conversational fabrics that keep faith alive. Here, then, is the problem constituted by Ruth. Her situation is sharply defined by law. She can never find her place within the community of God. But, as every reader has always known, the book of Ruth will conclude in the way legislated by history. Ruth will marry Boaz, and their child will be grandfather to King David. In a sense, then, all the delays in the narrative, the episodes drawn out over a summer, the outrageous move that sends Ruth dressed and scented to the granary floor and to Boaz's feet on a harvest night, all contain a hidden necessity. The ending is legislated in advance. The ending that no matter what these prohibitions are, because of chesed, because of loving kindness, because of connectivity, seeing the potential for connection, despite barriers and animosity and history and conflict, that redemption and the seeds of the messianic future are sown through what Ruth reaps and through what we can reap if we are able to transform this conflict, this issue, and conflict in general in our worlds into something that is generative, that we see this conflict and conflict in general not as a barrier to progress, but rather as the fertile ground for moving forward. So we are now a few minutes past 12. I am still available for a few minutes longer. I'm going to turn to the chat box. Thank you for being here. I hope that you can bring, whether if you have to jump off, bring greater chesed to your Shabbat and the week ahead, weeks ahead, especially as we prepare for this very difficult election season here in the United States, in the Jewish community and beyond. I will see if there are any, Julie, if there are any questions or comments you would like us to address in the last few minutes that we have online. I'm also scrolling backwards a bit to see if there's anything that might yes. So right. So Rosa points out this is of a piece with other conflicts, conflicts, sibling rivalries, noting Ishmael and Yitzchak. Yes, this is throughout the book of Genesis and reappears in other later books. Harriet, I'm not sure if this is my mom or another Harriet online. Mom, if it's you, we can have this conversation later. But yes, what about the great effort in the Gospels of the New Testament to tie Jesus to the Davidic line? That is very much a matter of how huge was the figure of David in the late Second Temple period. That was King David's that was King David's mount and his son Solomon's temple rebuilt, and people knew it. That myth was a truth. That story lived large in the Judaisms, the Jewishness, the Jewish identities that existed at the beginning of the Common Era 2,000 years ago. So Carrie points out, Ruth had a loophole. She was able to enter by renouncing her Moabite heritage. Your people shall be my people. Interesting. Maybe that's how we get around this. And I'm not sure actually if that's how we can resolve the conflict within the biblical text. That is definitely a part of the way that our community treats conversion these days. It is in the language of the Talmud, nolad kekatan dame, which is one is born anew. One is reborn through the process of conversion and immersion in the mikvah. So it's less about a renouncing of family ties, one's birth family, but really more about the mythic imagination, the moral imagination is what does it mean in converting into the Jewish people to be reborn.